Chapter 78, Knight Takes Queen. Knight Takes Queen. Jaehaera smiled, watching the group milling about her, laughing and talking, Sörnd and Asdale in the center of it all as they prepared for their departure. Late though they had been in getting to bed, everyone had risen to see the pair off, their group slowly gathering outside the inn in the pale grey dawn, helping to load the mule and make their last farewells. Jaehaera had already told the others of Jordan's offer that morning as they had taken breakfast, waiting for Fritha to fetch the mule from the stables a few streets away, and though they had all expressed similar reservations, the promise of 7,000 gold pieces was enough to convince them, and it was agreed unanimously. Fritha had been overjoyed at the verdict, sending a message over to the Mithrest to inform his lordship of their acceptance, a neat map of the hills and a reply returned with the same boy expressing the lord's satisfaction and giving them directions to the holding of man named Garin, who would be able to give them further instructions. Jaehaera cast her eyes up to the sky, trying to get a measure of the weather in which they would soon be traveling. Heavy clouds were hanging in the west, and though it was cold, the sun was slowly rising in the east, the air fresh and pleasant enough to leave her itching to be away herself. Their journey to the Wind Spears would be long and arduous, and she hoped enough so to dissuade many a bounty hunter in favor of easier prey.
"Well, you've likely a fine day for it,"
Jaehaera greeted as Sörnd left the small crowd to make his way over to her, Asdale sat quietly at his hip. The druid smiled.
"We both have. I am glad that you have managed to secure this final quest. There is a sense of completeness to my departure now." "So then, Sörnd, all set?"
called a voice behind them, Fritha stepping from the inn where she had been collecting a freshly baked loaf for the druid's lunch.
"And hello there, Curly Bonce,"
she trilled as she reached them, giving Asdale's hair an affectionate ruffle.
"Oh, not long now until you're off on your adventure."
Jaehaera watched as Fritha faltered, glancing briefly to her as though wary of some censure as she asked Sörnd,
Can I?" "Certainly."
The man laughed, seeming happy to hand the child over to the girl after 2 days of unfounded distance, Fritha beaming as she chatted to the boy now on her hip.
"Come on, Asdale, come and meet a friend of mine."
They watched as she took him over to meet the mule Anomen and Minsk were loading, Fritha crouching slightly and showing Asdale how to gently stroke the soft grey hair of his neck, Ari stooping to fuss over the boy as well. Even Valigar looked mildly interested now. It seemed Asdale was no longer constantly on the verge of tears, the ranger making some comment that sent Ari a fierce red as Herdalis looked suddenly uneasy, and the rest of them laughed, the child oblivious to all as he watched the mule watch him. At her side, Sörnd sighed wistfully.
"I will miss this company. I never thought anything could make this city bearable, but you all did."
Jaehaera smiled.
"They have that way of growing on you. So which route will you be taking to trade meat?" "The southern road and then up through the Hangkode Pass. It is longer than the more direct route but less prone to flooding. And yourselves?"
Jaehaera shrugged, seeing that almost 10 days of traveling ahead of them.
"The greater east-western way for the first few days, then we will likely cut through the hills to make the rest of the way south. It is a wilderness out there, no roads or villages. I am quite looking forward to it,"
she added with a laugh that he shared.
"Come, the caravan is due to leave soon. I doubt they will wait for you."
A few last well wishes as the others returned to the tavern and their own packing, only Jaehaera, Fritha, Ari, and Anomen accompanying the druid to the gates, Fritha at their head and still bearing Asdale as they walked, the child making attempts to join in as she serenaded him and anyone else awake at that hour, with a rousing marching song.
Some talk of Drizzt Do'Urden, and some of Pericles, of Wulfgar and Elminster, and such great names as these. But of all the world's brave heroes, there's none that leads the fight, with such a stout and valiant heart as the Purple Dragon Knight. Now, Dragon Knights are fearless and Fritha, what are you singing to the boy?
Jahara interrupted sharply before she could really get into the second verse, Fritha glancing back with a confused frown as though she thought it obvious.
Cerns from Cormyr, everyone must learn the songs of their homeland, mustn't they, Asdale?
Cern smiled slightly, nodding his mild acquiescence.
Quite so, but you forget I am originally from Ithkatla. Oh, yes,
Fritha laughed, turning immediately to the knight walking next to him.
Anomen, which songs did you learn as a child?
Anomen looked, for a moment, caught out though he answered after a thoughtful pause.
Well, there was the midsummer fair and I saw a ship. Oh, I know that one!
Fritha exclaimed, beaming as she returned her attentions to the child.
I saw a ship a-sailing on the sea. And, oh, but it was laden with pretty things for thee.
The caravan was already outside the gates, making the last preparations for their departure. It was a small one, only a few covered wagons with a surrounding company of guards and smaller carts, Cern already having arranged a place for Asdale with the caravan master's wife, safe and warm inside the one of the wagons, while he would lead the mule behind it on foot. Their group had halted before the gates. Asdale returned to his father's care, the man clinching the child on his hip with one hand, the mule's halter secure in the other as they made their final goodbyes.
So, this is it, as the aging lion must leave his pride so must we also part. Aye,
sighed Fritha,
but though the swallows leave for the winter, they may yet return in the spring,
finished Airy solemnly, before she snorted and the two girls were lost to laughter. Cern just shook his head, still smiling as Jahara stepped forward.
Well, it has been good traveling with you, Cern, perhaps our paths will cross again one day. Indeed.
He agreed, adding quietly,
you will remember my offer, will you not? It still stands for when your current brood has managed to fly the nest.
Jahara dipped her face in a slow nod.
I will bear it in mind. Safe journey, little one. You too.
She smiled, clapping the druid on the arm. He nodded once and then as an afterthought leaned in and kissed her cheek.
My thanks, Jahara, for all you have done.
Cern turned, passing under the great stone gateway to join the others as the cry for the off went up from the head wagon, Fritha still shouting after them.
And you must sing to him, Cern, you must teach him all the songs of his homeland. And be good, donkey.
Cern glanced back with a smile and held up a hand in one last farewell before he turned to lead the mule after the final wagon as the caravan slowly set off. Fritha sighed, a mix of satisfied and wistful as they turned from the gates.
Well, I suppose we should get back to the inn and get ready to leave ourselves.
Back at the coronet, the common room was slowly filling as other patrons rose to face the day, most of their own group still back in their rooms packing though some had finished, much to Anomen's discomfort. The knight frowned, refilling his cup even though the tea was only an inch from the rim, anything to distract him from the pair sat opposite him. Airy and Herr Dallas were the only others at the table and seemed to want to make the most of these last few moments of virtual solitude before they were once more forced to spend every moment with a group. They were sat close, their quiet talk punctuated by Airy's giggling, the pair blind to all but each other and painful to watch.
Right, how are we?
Sang a voice behind him, Fritha appearing at the table, a pack at her back when she stopped, suddenly transfixed as she watched Airy feed the tiefling a piece of apple and seal it with a light kiss. Fritha glanced to him looking utterly nauseated.
I think I'll wait outside.
Anomen nodded and grabbed his cloak.
I will join you.
In the street, the sky had darkened, heavy pillow-like clouds full of snow rolling in on the west wind. It felt as though the sky was lower than usual, just skimming the surrounding rooftops, and Fritha had the strangest fancy that she could reach up and touch it.
It could snow within the next few hours,
offered ARandomAud evenly. Fritha sighed, wondering if this plan wasn't a fool's errand, whatever coin was promised.
Well, we will be traveling today on the roads, so.
She stopped as light laughter echoed above them, Fritha climbing the steps next to them to see Lus out playing on the flat rooftop next to the inn. The young girl knelt over a scattering of knuckle bones, a ball in hand as she prepared for her move, a small wooden tusked pig solemnly watching the proceedings.
Lus!
called Fritha, the girl glancing up, and suddenly she was racing across to them, pig in hand, and almost tripping over her own feet in boots that looked solid enough albeit a few sizes too large.
Fritha! Fritha!
she lisped, closing upon them for Fritha to confirm her 2 front teeth were missing, the bard giving a theatrical gasp.
Goodness, Lus, where have your teeth gone? Ah, don't tell me, you've been fighting, haven't you? Oh, Lus, and I thought you were such a nice girl.
Lus giggled delightedly.
No, silly, they were just baby teeth. I did as Mama told me, and put them under my pillow, and the tooth mouse came and swapped them for a whole 3 coppers. I bought Hanir, see?
She beamed, showing them the handsome wooden pig painted in browns and oranges, closer inspection revealing a long crack along its side.
Oh, he looks like he's been in the wars.
Lus nodded, frowning as she explained,
Yes, Flyk and I were arguing. She said I had hidden her hairbrush, but that was only because she had eaten my share of jam at supper last 10th day. And she said it was Nira, but I knew it hadn't been because she doesn't like blackberries, and I still wouldn't tell Flyk where her brush was, so she threw Hanir off the roofs.
The child had said this all very quickly, her tale ending to find her pink in breathless indignation.
Oh dear, here let me see,
Fritha smiled, tutting as she took the toy from her unresisting hands to better examine it.
It's serious, I'll give you that. Luckily for you, my friend ARandomAud here is a cleric.
The girl brightened instantly.
Oh yes, I remember, can you help him, sir?
ARandomAud drew back, looking rather perturbed as both girls turned to him.
Well, Now, ARandomAud,
Fritha admonished, an impish smirk hiding behind the sober look,
you must heal poor Hanir, it is your solemn duty as a priest. But, my lady. Come now, put out your hand,
Fritha cut in, taking his hand to raise it palm up and place the small pig carefully within.
There. Now be good, Hanir, don't bite him.
She warned the creature, eliciting a giggle from Lus, Fritha taking the knight's other hand to place it gently over the top and cover the wooden pig from view. Lus watched, memorized, as Fritha lightly placed her hands about his, and ARandomAud felt the toy within tremble with a sudden heat, Fritha stepping back to allow him to reveal the fine wooden pig, as whole as it had ever been.
Oh, Hanir,
cried Lus as he lowered his hand to offer it back to her,
you're all mended. Thank you, sir.
ARandomAud smiled gently.
You are very welcome, young lady. Fritha? ARandomAud?
Came a voice she recognized as Jahara's echoing up from the street behind them, Fritha glancing back at the sound.
Oh, sounds like we have to go. You and Hanir be careful now, Lus, and no more fighting with your sister. She started it.
The girl shouted after them with a laugh.
Your magic grows,
said ARandomAud as they crossed for the stairs, though his tone was free of the distrust she had heard from others on the matter. Fritha smiled.
Yes, mending broken pigs today, and, if Valigar is to be believed, tomorrow I'll be leveling cities and enslaving the hearts of men.
ARandomAud laughed.
I do not think you need any magic for that. Oh, my apologies,
he faltered, suddenly uncomfortable.
I did not mean.
Frithia shook her head, embarrassed herself.
No, I shouldn't have. Frithia.
The girl quickened her pace.
Coming.
The rest of the group were already gathered in the street, Ari managing to tear her attention from Herr Dallas long enough to send Frithia a pointed look as she descended the steps with Anomen, though she was given no chance to comment.
Ah, Frithia, there you are,
said Jahara.
We are ready to depart bar one final matter. Did you speak to the ostler as agreed?
Frithia nodded.
Yes, and our next lucky beast of burden has been arranged and is awaiting us now, a moonchain pony.
Anomen just caught a glimpse of Frithia's wicked grin as she turned to set off.
I named him Toffee.
Jahara looked like she just wrestled herself away from biting, her voice wavering with strained interest as she inquired,
Really? Yes, though it was going to be Princess if he had been a girl. How nice.
And it was to Frithia's teasing they made their way over to the stables to collect the stout grey pony she had bought, loading their tents and other supplies upon its strong back, and it was another hour before they had left the city gates, taking the main road westwards from the city. Frithia glanced back before they disappeared into the forests for one last look at the city she would not likely see for a good month or more, the stone sprawl subfusk under dark clouds. They were about an hour or so along the road now, their march not so fast as to prevent chatter, though brisk enough to leave them breathless with it, Frithia leading the pony at their rear and taking an unusual delight in the trip. The snow had not come in the end, the clouds rolling onwards into the east at a pace Frithia rather wished they could match, the morning suddenly dawning anew as the sky cleared, the air bright and crisp, alive with talk, bird song, and cheerful beat of hooves over the hard ground, the ice that had pooled in the frozen tracks of cartwheels melting in the weak sunlight. The pony next to her snorted, his breath misting, and Frithia smiled, letting her eyes drift back to those before her. Ari and Herr Dallas were walking close to each other as they chatted with Minsk and Anomen, the ranger giving up his usual position at their head to Valigar and Jahara. Things had been hard for all of them this last 10 days, and though there would still no doubt be trials to come, Frithia finally felt as though there was an end in sight, and one better than she would have before imagined. Minsk now had a high-ranking witch Laren prepared to speak in his defense when he returned to his homelands. Ari and Herr Dallas had each other and Anomen. Frithia watched the tall blue-cloaked figure before her laugh mildly, letting it strengthen her will. Anomen could return to the order, go on campaigns with his brothers and begin the life he had spent so long working towards, and he would be happy. She felt herself nod firmly. Her decision was the best one for them both, and she liked to think that one day Anomen would look back, when he was a little older with a proper lady of a wife and many glorious campaigns behind him, and he would realize the same. Perhaps Nalya would have her lands returned to her by then, and Frithia imagined the pair meeting up to take tea together somewhere in the city, talking about the old times and the people they had once traveled with. She would be no more than a memory. Frithia swallowed, raising her face to the icy blue sky and waiting for the tears to subside. It was the right decision and all for the best. She was not sure where she noticed it first, as a noise in the air or a rhythm in her feet, only that suddenly the sound of a horse was pounding the road behind her. She swung back in time to see a bay mare crest the slight slope at a canter, and Frithia was about to order everyone off the path, when the rider saw them and slowed the beast to a trot. He was young, about 17 she guessed as he closed to them, dark hair windswept and tanned face flushed with the cold, his eyes quickly surveying their group before coming to rest on their resident knight.
Sir Anomendelran?
He asked, breathless as he slipped deftly from the saddle, the reins still in his hands, his cloak billowing back to reveal the crest of the order upon his scarlet tunic. Anomen looked a touch alarmed.
It is I. I am Squire Trulin, sir, and I am sent by the order with a message. There is no easy way to tell you this, but I regret to inform you your father has passed on.
A surprised muttering of oaths and sympathies that hushed almost instantly. Anomen looked saddened by the news, but quietly so, his regrets perhaps more for what could have been than what was. Fritha the first to break the heavy silence, relinquishing the pony's halter to Ari as she stepped to his side.
Anomen, I am so sorry. We will return to the city at once. No, there will be no need, my lady,
he assured her gently, turning to the lad to confirm.
It was the drink, I suppose.
Trulin blinked.
Ah, no, sir, he was murdered. Murdered? Yes, sir,
the squire continued quickly,
in the early hours of this morning. The assassin was caught soon afterwards, though injured in the capture. He only just awoke in the Helmites infirmary and confessed all. He was hired by one Serk Farad. The merchant has barricaded himself in his house and refuses to come out, though the city guards and a contingent from the order have him surrounded, so it is only a matter of time.
But Anomen barely seemed to be listening to him, the knight slowly shaking his head.
Dead, the last of my family gone. First my sister and now my father dead by this man, this Serk. My father was right all along, that merchant was the one who murdered Moira.
He turned to the girl still at his side, his eyes dark.
And you convinced me otherwise.
Fritha was so stunned, she could hardly find the breath for her.
What? Now, Anomen,
reasoned Jahara, but Fritha had found her voice now and with it a burning desire to assure Anomen she was not to blame for this injustice.
Anomen, I understand you're upset, but how can you say that? I did all I could to support you when your sister was taken, how can you hold me responsible?
She had hoped the injured tone which she took no trouble to conceal would calm him somewhat, but it was as though he was a different person, his grief and guilt leaving him suddenly furious.
I wanted to take Serk's life when Moira was first killed, to take the justice both my father and my honor cried out for, and you told me to let him go. I told you to look for evidence and there was none. We went to the magistrate and she said herself there was nothing to be done within the law. Perhaps you should both.
Ari trailed off as neither looked to her, the pair focused solely on each other.
The law,
Anomen scoffed unpleasantly,
and when did you begin to care for such a thing?
Fritha flushed, defiant in the sting of his words.
I don't, but I seem to recall that order of yours liking it well enough. Anomen,
Jahara attempted again,
we understand you have just lost your father. My father,
he spat savagely.
Ha! I care not a whit for him, but for my sister, for sweet Moira, her murderer free all this time when I should have been the one to avenge her.
He whirled back to Fritha.
And you stopped me with talk of laws you yourself hold only in contempt. I did my best and advised you as the knight you aspired to be.
Anomen just shook his head.
And yet how little concern you have for my vocation now as you drag me about the city, an accomplice to your crimes. You,
Fritha breathed, too hurt to think of a name to call him.
I never dragged you anywhere and there is a difference between housebreaking and cold-blooded murder. And one you seem happy to ignore, you wanted to take revenge on a man when we had no proof he was even the killer. No,
Anomen agreed, throwing his pack to the ground and swinging himself into the waiting saddle, the squire too stunned to protest.
But we know well enough now and I will see him dead for it. Anomen, dismount from there immediately,
ordered Jahara, though Fritha was of a different mind.
Go then!
She screamed up at him,
go and murder as many merchants as it will take to assuage you of the guilt that it was you who left your sister to her fate while you pursued dreams of a nice shiny knighthood. And what would you know of it?
He roared back.
I am not the one who is tainted by murder's blood.
A collective gasp, even a no-man looking stunned by the words that had just left his mouth, and perhaps it would have shocked him into taking stock of the situation had the squire not used this moment of silence to finally find his voice.
Ah, sir. You will return to the order on foot, squire,
a no-man barked, sharply wheeling the horse about.
Yes, sir,
the lad saluted, though the knight was already gone, the horse leaving them at a gallop, kicking up a hail of dirt in his wake.
That bloody knight!
Frithia shrieked after him, her eyes falling on the bag he had dumped at her feet, and suddenly she was taking her frustrations out on the worn leather pack, kicking it violently until she was too tired to continue. She dropped to a crouch, burying her head in her knees to catch her breath. A hand at her shoulder followed by a voice, quiet and kind.
Frithia. It's all right, Jahara,
she sighed, making to stand again and finally take in the group of stunned faces behind her.
I'm all right. Do you think he will be okay?
Ventured Airy, the elf's eyes still fixed on the horizon. A no-man had just disappeared over.
I've never seen him so angry. I have,
muttered Frithia.
After he first learned his sister had been killed and the magistrate informed him there was not enough evidence for an arrest, I told him he should heed the law, and look where it has got him. This isn't your fault,
snapped Jahara promptly.
I know it's not. So what do we do now?
asked Valigar, a voice of calm in the rising tempers.
Who says a no-man chose his own path, so let him be the one to walk it. We can't just leave him, Minsk, he might do something foolish. I think that is a certainty. Herr Dallas.
Frithia glanced to the still silent squire at her side.
I don't suppose you want to come to the Wind Spears with us, do you?
He shook his head mutely. Frithia sighed again.
Didn't think so.
She picked up a no-man's pack and thrust it at the lad, all determination, as she turned on her heel and started back in the direction of the city.
Come on then.
And as a group they made to follow her. Frithia stalked along, her jaw clenched. She would save a no-man from himself, and then she was going to kill him. A no-man kept his eyes fixed resolutely ahead, the clattering hoofbeats echoing in his ears, his knees bent and posting with the rhythm of the horse beneath him as it carried him through the blur of streets at a brisk trot. His mount had been tired after its journey out with the squire, unable to keep up that gallop for longer than a few minutes, and he had let the horse slow to a modest canter for the rest of the way back to the city. A no-man felt the hatred pulse through his heart with every hoofbeat, the duration of the ride giving time for his fury to calm into a cold anger. Serk, that murderer! He and his father's petty quarrel had robbed him of a much-loved sister, and a no-man hated that Lord Cor had been right in his accusations, because if he had been right about that, then perhaps there was a slim possibility he had been right about other things as well. His father had spent his youth telling him he was not good enough to become a paladin, that the order would never accept him as a knight, and then when the song had changed, he was not worthy to be counted in their ranks, and one day the order would realize what his father had known all along, and a no-man would be dismissed in shame. And the worst thing was, a part of a no-man had always worried he was right. Those 4 long years as squire, laboring under the shadow of such doubt that even now when he was knighted he could not quite shake the feeling. However desperately he tried to quell it, his temper was as vile as his father's had been, something the man had been all too pleased to point out to him whenever they had fought, Lord Cor crowing about how it was inevitable that one day it would get the better of him and Anoman would shame both the order and himself, and sometimes the knight just wished it would happen so he did not have the worry of it hanging over him any longer. It already felt as if it was unavoidable when he could say such things to one he had professed to care for so ardently. His anger at finding his father had been killed by the same man who had murdered dear Moira only months before had left him reeling with an agonizing guilt which had screamed for an outlet. And there was Fritha at his sleeve, so mild and kind. It had been so hard those last few days, ignoring the love and passions and worries he felt for the girl, and in that moment when they had fought, he had just wanted to break it, destroy whatever was between them so wholly that there was no room even for hope anymore. Well, it was surely done now, his mind recalling for him an image of her face, not stunned as the others had been but twisted with an anger that had matched his own. There was no way she would be reconsidering her decision. His family was dead, his love lost, and the blame for it all could be placed upon one man. Anoman rounded that last corner, the house he sought about halfway along the wide street. It was hardly the estate his family owned, but it was a large house all the same and looked grand even there, on that street of fine buildings, the house set back from the street and surrounded by tall iron railings, a flight of polished marble steps leading up to the front door. Many members of the watch were stood outside, some just talking while others kept back the crowds of people that were already gathering, and Anoman recognized a few squires from the order in their number, a young lad he knew as Squire Varon, busy directing things from the other side of the street. Anoman gave his mount a jolt with his heels and quickened its pace. Now he would face Serk and he would bring him justice or death. The crowds had parted hastily before him and Anoman clattered to a halt in the men's midst to swing himself from the saddle, an unnamed squire stepping in to take the reins as Varon rushed to his side.
"Sir Anoman, you've arrived!"
he cried, clearly glancing about for Trullan, but he was given no chance to question the squire's absence.
"Indeed,"
said Anoman, his gaze fixed on the house before him. "What of Serk?"
"He is still barricaded in his home, sir, though we have both this entrance and the back of the building covered." "He has hostages?"
questioned Anoman, surprised they had yet to storm in and merely force his arrest.
"Well, no sir, but the order wanted to minimize the potential for civil disturbance. We have had orders to await the arrival of Sir Gethin before." "There have been new orders,"
interrupted Anoman.
"Send for a battering ram. A contingent will remain at the back of the house to block any escape while we enter by the main doors and secure the house room by room. Any man that resists will be met with force." "Yes, sir."
Fritha marched along, not bothering to check how the others were keeping up as she strode through the streets. It had taken less time to return to the city than they had in leaving it, but it had still been an hour and the march had given her time to calm down, if only because being furious required energy and she just didn't have enough spare at the pace she was driving them. So after a lot of raging, a bit of crying and longer than both of those activities spent sulking, Fritha finally came to the conclusion that Anoman had been upset about his father and sister, and possibly some other things which were her fault, and although she was not pleased by his reaction, she at least understood it. Fritha sidestepped past a man who had suddenly stopped to look in a shop window, just managing to keep her pace and having to stop herself from breaking into a jog. She wanted to be there. She wanted the inevitable confrontation with Anoman to be over with, the girl unable to stop going over it in her mind, what she would say, how she would respond to his many possible answers. She expected of him what she felt herself, a little anger, a little embarrassment and a lot of contrition. She never should have made that comment about his sister, even if it was true, in fact, especially if it was true. Fritha feeling her guilt anew as she recalled the spite of using their closeness to really drive the blade home. Fritha watched the end of the street come closer with every step, a small swell of panic fluttering through her heart. She hated feeling like this. Gods, she hoped a no-man would be ready to talk as soon as they arrived, that he had not done anything rash. Another surge of fierce panic, though she quelled it. Even if the ride had not given him enough of an opportunity to calm down, there would be others of the order there who would not just let him stride in there and murder the man. No, everything would be fine, Frithia reasoned firmly as she rounded that final corner. She stopped. The street was in an uproar, crowds of onlookers gathered about the front of a tall handsome house, the city watch keeping them back and shouting orders to one another, a no-man himself nowhere to be seen. Frithia glanced back, those behind her looking just as stunned. Squire Trullan just stood gaping, the pony's halter slack in his hand as he stared down the street.
"Where are the other squires?"
he questioned aloud.
"He can't have,"
breathed Ari, looking fearful. Frithia was gone in an instant.
"Frithia!"
But Jahara's cry was duly ignored, Frithia fighting her way through the crowds, her heart beating wildly. He wouldn't have, he just wouldn't have. The guards let her through on sight, Jahara but a step behind her, and the pair reached the house just as Squire Varan appeared at the doorway and the boy running down the steps looking frantic.
"My lady Frithia, oh, thanks be. He is inside." Everything was going well. We were moving through the house securing the rooms one by one. Most of the house guards just surrendered when they saw us. But when we reached upstairs, Sarek was there in the main hall. Sir Anoman confronted him with his crime and the bastard just laughed. Anoman went mad. I have never seen him so angry. He is threatening to kill him. "Oh gods!"
Frithia cried, frantically tearing past him and up the steps, the dim hallway and wide staircase but a blur as she raced up to the first floor, the stairs leading straight to the tall mahogany doors, both thrown wide on that deathly silent hall. Everyone within was frozen. Guards, squires and servants alike stood at the edges of that huge room, no more animated than the finely upholstered benches and low tables set about them. A young girl in a fine yellow gown was quietly comforting the older woman sat next her who was choking on her own dry sobs, presumably Sarek's wife and daughter. And all were transfixed by the pair before them. Varan had been right, Frithia had never seen a no-man looking so furious, the old merchant on his knees and only just, a large gauntlet fist clasped about the neck of his robes so tightly he was having trouble breathing, his face already bearing a grazed cheek and bloody lip while a no-man loomed over him, his mace drawn and trembling in his rage. The others were gathering at her back, a stillness over them all as they watched the scene before them, a no-man shaking as he demanded,
"Your quarrel was with my father, why bring Moira into it? Answer me." "I wanted him to suffer,"
Sarek spat hoarsely.
"She was his only comfort so I took it."
The merchant's face twisted with a sadistic smile.
"I heard she begged for mercy as they choked the life out of her."
His words had the predictable effect, a no-man enraged as he raised the mace above his head.
"You!"
Frithia heard the word leave her throat before she even realized it.
"A no-man!"
All heads whipped to the sound to find her there before the doorway, a no-man staring back at her as though she had risen from the dead.
"Frithia!" "Yes,"
she nodded, slowly moving into the room as she added with a nervous laugh,
"You did not think you could quit our argument so easily, did you?"
She gestured to the man he held.
"A no-man, please, I know you are angry, but you have to let him go."
The knight looked stricken.
"He murdered my sister. It is just." "Yes, I know,"
Frithia agreed, still edging forward, her heavy-soled boots clicking slightly on the grey marble tiles,
"and he should be punished for it, but not like this. Please."
A no-man shook his head, his shoulders slumping defeatedly.
"You do not understand, Frithia, the anger I feel sometimes, so strong as to consume me. I have ruined everything."
Frithia pressed her lips together, the tears welling as her desperation rose.
Anomen, please, there is nothing you have done yet you cannot come back from.
At their knees, Serk managed a contemptuous snort.
Listen to you mule, pathetic boy. I should have killed your whore here, then how you would have wept. Silence!
Anomen roared, shaking the man so violently he fell sideways, his daughter crying out as Serk fought to regain his balance before he was strangled by the neck of his robes.
Anomen, please,
Fritha begged, almost next to him now.
Don't do this. This is what Serk wants, he knows he will hang and he would see you ruined too.
Anomen whirled back to her, her own desperation echoed in his wide wild eyes.
So I will be ruined. So? What does it matter? Why should you even care? You do not love me.
Fritha felt her heart twist, heavy with the confession that had been pressing on her for a while now.
No.
She admitted quietly, raising her head to look up at him as openly as she had ever faced anyone,
but I should like the chance to try.
The room about them seemed to hold their breath as she took that last step forward and reached out a hand to gently tug at his sleeve. A loud smash of shattering ceramics as his mace hit the tiled floor, Serk freed to collapse in a gasping heap next to it. Anomen was shaking his head slowly, unfocused and drawn as though he had just awoken from some nightmare.
Please excuse me a moment.
He walked from her, disappearing through the archway behind them, the guards moving in to seize Serk as Jahara rushed over to gather Fritha to her, the girl nodding through the many questions on her well-being, feeling suddenly exhausted as she gently pushed the druid back and made to follow the knight. The archway had led onto a small dayroom, the room itself appointed with a balcony that faced southwards. Anomen stood at the railings looking out over the city, bright and bustling under a cold high sun, oblivious to his misery, and he wondered if it would even care if it knew.
Anomen.
He turned to face her, Fritha looking as worn and tired as he felt. She managed a smile for him, though she did not look any happier for it, the girl moving to his side to gaze out over the city as he had been.
I acted outside of my superior's commands,
Anomen continued eventually, the cool distance of the subject all he could manage just then.
The order will wish to speak to me of this. And there will be Serk's initial trial and my father's affairs to be put in order.
He glanced to her, wondering if he assumed too much as he asked,
I may need to remain in the city for a few days.
Fritha merely nodded, eyes still watching the streets below.
That is fine, take as much time as you need, I understand there is much to prepare for your father's funeral as well. When will you hold it? Tomorrow,
Anomen answered promptly.
I will arrange everything with Temple this afternoon, my father can be cremated privately as Moira was. He had no friends and I have no desire to arrange a gathering so a few more compassionate merchants can pretend he had.
Fritha turned a pained look upon him.
Anomen. I have hated the man for years and now he is dead,
he cut in bluntly.
I see no reason why he should have any further influence upon my life.
The girl said nothing, just sighed tiredly, returning her attention to the city before them, the silence between them compelling him to speak again and finally discover what had been thrown into doubt the instant as he had looked up and found her in that room before him.
Fritha, what I said before, when we fought.
She shook her head.
We both said things, just forget it. I am sorry,
he pressed. She sighed again, leaning forward to rest her elbows upon the railings and cup her chin in her hands.
Yes, me too. No, I am, truly,
he continued, wishing he could somehow convey to her the depth of his regrets.
What I said, I have never thought that, and I was so sure you would hate me and then you were here.
He swallowed dryly.
You came.
Frithha smiled faintly and shook her head as though there was a joke somewhere he was missing.
Of course I did. Don't doubt it next time, eh?
She patted his arm gently and turned to go.
Just come back through when you're ready.
An Anoman turned to watch her leave, little more than a shadow as she passed through the gloom of the dayroom and disappeared back through the archway beyond. Frithha closed her eyes as the clouds above her parted to reveal a weak afternoon sun, a light breeze stirring her hair and the long grass at her feet both, the coldness muted by the high walls as she sat in the sheltered garden of Anoman's old home waiting for him to finish directing the servants and lock up. He had decided that the house was not needed now his father was gone, the old place to be shut up until a time when it would once more be the seat of the Dulrin household, Anoman's first responsibility as the young lord, finding new positions about the city for the few servants who had still remained there to serve his father. Frithha kept her eyes shut, seeing the place about her in her mind. The girl sat on a wall that bordered a raised bed full of azalea bushes, ivy, and a flowerless honeysuckle climbing the trellis against the wall behind her. The other 3 walls were bare of flowers, being parts of the house, the covered walkway that ran along the lower floor opposite her providing the basis of the balcony above, both floors able to open out onto the small garth. She sighed and opened her eyes again, letting them drift over the soothing green of the garden about her, overgrown from a summer of neglect and a touch melancholy now the winter was upon them. The gnarled leafless boughs of an old lemon tree curved above her, reaching thin branches up to the icy blue sky. The snows that had been threatening on that first day of their departure had remained absent, but Frithha knew it could not last. With every day that passed the winter only deepened. That morning had dawned the first of Nidal, the first day of the last month, and the second would see their group setting out from the city once more, heading for the wind spears and whatever trials there they had yet to face. But before then, they at least had one final day of simpler pleasures to enjoy. The first of Nidal had another name there on the Sword Coast, the Feast of the Moon, the traditional Day of the Dead, when people would feast and drink, holding street revels and telling stories of the gods and their own favored ancestors. A merry day for most, a more melancholy one for some others of their company. Jahara had left the inn early that morning, she, Valigar and Minsk leaving the city with plans to walk out into the surrounding forests and make their prayers and think on those lost. Frithas were yet to be made though she would go soon, an hour of her time tithed in scribing awaiting her at the temple of Ogma. Those last few days in the city seemed to have passed both slow and quick by turns. Anoman had had much to do in the aftermath of his father's death, the others bearing the delay with voiceless understanding, and Frithha felt some of them rather enjoyed the break. Ari and Herr Dallas often found curled together in the snug of the coronet, dreaming the days away. Frithha had kept out of their way. She knew her presence, though not the cause of their separation, had hardly helped matters and she was just glad enough to have Herr Dallas back and Ari happy to leave the couple alone, the girl spending most of her time, when not out with Anoman, in Jahara's room, the pair often sitting in companionable silence as Jahara read and she played her new lute with out-of-practice fingers. The druid had been quiet since Cern had left, Jahara at first attributing it to the man's offer, which she had divulged to a very surprised Frithha on their first evening. But after a while, Frithha had realized there was something else troubling the woman too, hours of reading yielding hardly a turned page, and Jahara had eventually confessed she had yet to hear anything back from Derman or any of the other harpers for that matter. Frithha had not asked any more questions after that. She had forgiven Jahara on that very day they had battled Galvari, but the woman's betrayal, however unintentional, hung between them still. At least her days with Anoman had left Frithha too tired to worry much, the pair about the city attending meetings with lawyers and clerks of every nature. There was, as he had predicted, a hearing at the order between he, Sir Ryan and Prelate Wes Allen. Frithha perched nervously on a bench in the corridor outside the latter's office, the relief leaving her knees weak as Anoman had finally reappeared in the doorway, solemn and flushed as he had saluted his 2 superiors. And then there had been the start of Serk's trial and the arrangements for the funeral and the reading of his father's will. Lord Cor had left everything to Anoman in the end, though whether intentionally or that he just had never sobered up enough to write him out of it, neither of them knew. The clerk had been very helpful though, already taking it upon himself to settle the man's debts beforehand and cheerfully informing the knight that even now the many creditors had been paid, there was still actually quite a bit of the estate left, the clerk rattling off a list of assets which included the house there in the city, as well as a vineyard somewhere to the north and some lands to the east which were being rented out to local farmers. The older man had smiled there, explaining he understood that Anoman himself likely had little interest in settling down to run an estate, but if managed properly there was still enough left to bring in an income and he would compile him a list of reliable stewards who he could recommend for the position in his absence. Anoman had said nothing to this, merely nodded and thanked him, though he had clearly decided that at the moment he would let his inheritance lie fallow for a time. Frithia sighed again to herself, growing cold just sat. She had helped Anoman where she could those last few days, though most of the time all she could do was attend with him and she was not even sure anymore whether her presence was desired or not. She and Anoman had not spoken again of what had been said during their very unpleasant argument or, indeed, at Serk's house. At first, every moment which found them alone together she had feared him bringing it up. And then time went on, and she had begun to anticipate it, and this last day she had been fighting against mentioning it herself. But she did not, and neither did he, and Frithia wondered if perhaps he did not want to forget the whole thing. After all, it had hardly been one of the shining moments of Anoman's life and she felt again the sting of his words as she recalled their fight, her mind unable to help but dwell upon it in the long silences. Oh, not the comment Anoman had clearly regretted. After all, there was no getting away from the fact she was a Valspawn and she knew Anoman did not, nor ever had considered her tainted, it had just been her own spite prompting his. No, it had been his other accusation that had really hurt, Frithia not liking to think that she had been dragging him about the city, risking his knighthood and anger from his god, all for fear of her safety. And perhaps he had finally had chance to consider the same and agreed that they weren't best match. Frithia could have almost laughed, happy and sad in equal measure. Ah well, at least this way it took it all the responsibility from her rapidly weakening resolve. She glanced up with a smile as Anoman appeared from the long dining room that ran the length of the garden, clearly visible between the thin wooden columns of the walkway, the room's ornate shuttered doors all closed but one.
"They are just finishing covering the remaining furniture,"
he explained as he crossed the garth to sit next to her.
"They should not be much longer."
Frithia nodded.
"How is Sylvia?"
Anoman sighed.
"Still weeping. I can understand her sorrow, she has been here serving our family since before I was born. But she knows that the house needs to be closed up if no one is staying here. She has a position arranged along with Francis over at the Withben estate, they are good people, they will take care of her." "And will you be sorry to see the place shut up?"
Frithia asked quietly. Anoman gave a half-hearted shrug.
"I do not know. This house stopped feeling like my home long before I left, but perhaps in time it could be so again. But it would be a waste of coin to keep the place open when no one lives here, especially when I have quarters at the Order and the inn both and we barely spend 10 days together in the city. And now the feast of the moon is already upon us."
Frithia sighed, absently glancing again to the sky.
"This year seems to have gone so quickly." "Yes, I can hardly believe we will be leaving again for the Wind Spears tomorrow, it feels like an age ago that we first left the city gates together."
Frithia nodded. Anoman had not apologized for delaying their travels, the man perhaps finally realizing that their relationship had come past such a point.
"Yes, it has been a strange few days, hasn't it?" "Indeed,"
he murmured, the man gazing blankly at the garden about them, and for a moment they were silent before he turned to her again, his eyes avoiding her own.
Do you recall the day that began it all? How we spoke with the child, Lus, and had our quarrel. I truly thought it all over, and then you suddenly appeared in Serk's house.
Frith's stomach twisted unpleasantly. The subject had been so long in the anticipating, and now the moment had come. Fritha was no longer sure she wanted to talk of it, the girl laughing nervously as she admitted,
I'd be a bit hard-pressed to forget that part.
Anoman nodded, his lips twitching in brief of acknowledgement of her humor, though the frown was already creeping in as he continued.
I was so angry, so ready to throw everything away, and then you were there. And even then I clung to my anger. Do you remember what I said, how you could not care for my fate because you did not love me?
Fritha felt a nervous tremor run through her navel, her mouth suddenly dry, though he continued without giving her a chance to answer either way.
I thought long ago that if I could not have you as my love, I would rather have nothing, but I was wrong.
He glanced up, finally able to face her, it seemed.
I would have you as my friend again, Fritha, we can pretend none of this happened, just forget about it all.
Fritha smiled gently.
Anoman, I was always your friend. Yes, but it was different afterwards. I miss it. I should not have pursued you as I did.
He sighed, looking suddenly old.
I made you miserable. No.
She refuted instantly, before admitting with a sheepish laugh.
Well, yes, but it was nice too, and awkward and terrifying, but I would not change what happened. And
she swallowed dryly,
and we don't have to forget if you don't want to.
Anoman did not look at her, but the hoarseness of his voice gave away his emotion.
What you said to me, Fritha, I understand if it was to calm me, if you did not mean it.
Fritha dipped her face, the voices in her head screaming at her so she could barely hear her own reply.
I spoke no lie that day.
Silence. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, and Fritha could not even risk a glance to the man next to her, though perhaps words were not necessary, the girl looking down as her hand, which had been resting lightly on the wall beneath her, was slowly covered with one of his own. Fritha closed her eyes and dipped her head even further, burrowing it into the collar of her cloak as she felt the heat surge through her face, feeling very awkward and discomfited, and perhaps the tiniest glimmer of pleasure too.
Well, I think that's us about done, my lord,
came a gruff voice before them, Anoman jumping to his feet, Fritha finally able to look up at him and found his face was at least nowhere near as pink as hers likely was, though he still looked a touch embarrassed, the knight clearing his throat uncomfortably to give the last few instructions to Francis and the other servants. Fritha covered her face with her hand, laughing quietly at herself, the voice behind her eyes sighing deeply. Oh, bloody hells! They parted ways just outside the gate. Prayers for those family members who had passed made up an important part of the moon feast's celebrations, Fritha leaving him to make her own, though she did not say where she would be giving worship. He suspected it was not Mask's shrine. Anoman himself headed over to the temple to Helm to burn the usual incense for his mother, and now his sister and father as well. The man knelt before the altar with a few other latecomers, their muttered prayers rising up to the eaves with those fragile tendrils of scented smoke. And from there, it was only a short distance to the order's compound, and he walked the way slowly. Such a strange afternoon it had been, shutting up his old house, dismissing servants he had known all his life, his new role as lord of an estate unfamiliar enough to leave him feeling restless and out of sorts, and grinning like an idiot apparently, he considered wryly as he caught a glimpse his reflection in the dull grey canal beneath him. Fritha had been quiet those last few days. He had wanted to speak to her about Serk's house since it had happened, but he had felt ashamed, too. Fritha had returned to him even after what he had done and said, and Anoman felt he had no right to hope for more, their days together filled with tasks and appointments that only served to remind him of his shame, and on those only 2 occasions he had found his courage in the evenings. Fritha had not been in her room, though he could hear the telling strains of a lute drifting from under Jahara's door. But, at last, that afternoon the subject had been broached. He had expected her to smile and tell him what she always had, she was his friend, but any more between them was not possible, and that it was all for the best. And he had been so ready to accept it too, believing he had lost her friendship forever, making him realize just how much it meant to him. And then Anoman felt himself stop on the path, and for an instant he was back there in his garden, her hand cold beneath his. What she had said, how she had laughed and gone so red, and he just wanted to remember the moment over and over and never lose that sense of utter breathless joy, the feeling so large he felt as though he would burst. And then their parting at the gates, the girl just wishing him well and that she would see him back at the inn, not shy or embarrassed, just so natural, just as had once been, and it was wonderful. Anoman sighed and set out once more, feeling the smile fade on his face. He knew her plans could not have changed. That she would retrieve Imoen and then likely have to leave but who could say what the future held? The Harpers could not hunt her forever, and perhaps she could return, and Anoman forced the hope away, it would likely lead only to disappointment. If he could just have this, just cling to it for as long as he could, he would be happy. 2 squires he did not know were on guard at the gates, looking cold and bored though they straightened as they saw him, raising their hands in salute as he passed under the gate arch and made to cross the empty courtyard beyond. It had been difficult the last time he had returned to the order, his fate uncertain. As he had entered the prelate's office, the greying old paladin sat behind his desk, while Anoman's direct superior, Sir Ryan, stood at the man's side, dark eyes surveying him austerely. The meeting had been brief though. Anoman asked to explain his actions and motivations before the 2 men sternly reminded him of his oaths and duties as a knight. The killing of men, however guilty, was still murder, though they understood his circumstances and were glad he had turned from this path in the end. Fritha had been mentioned, but only her timely intervention, the men merely stating that they would have preferred the decision not to kill Serk had been more from his principles than his heart. Anoman had just nodded at this, though he wondered himself where the decision had actually come from. Had it even been anything she had said in the end? And Anoman felt he had half known the instant Fritha arrived that he would not kill the merchant, not because she had come or the soft tearful way she had pleaded, but merely because he could not have borne to become a murderer with her there watching him.
"Sir Anoman!"
called a deep friendly voice. Anoman turning to see Harn striding from the knight's quarters.
"If you are here for another meeting with the prelate, I am afraid he has returned home now. In fact, the order is very quiet today indeed,"
he added as he closed to him and they exchanged salutes.
"Most who can have returned to their homes to spend the day with their families." "Ah, no, Sir Harn, not the prelate, I was actually looking for Squire Trullan,"
Anoman admitted. Busy as he had been, Anoman had yet to see the squire since that first day, and he wished to thank the lad for his discretion concerning the argument he witnessed. Anoman felt that Sir Ryan and the prelate would have been decidedly less impressed with Fritha's influence on his actions if they had known it stretched to housebreaking and blackmail.
"Well, I believe the squire has returned home as well,"
said Harn after a pause to consider it.
"Though I understand his family resides only over in the north of the city. If the matter is urgent—" "No,
Anoman cut in,
it is not pressing."
Harn nodded and smiled good-naturedly.
"Very well then. I know I have not seen you in a while, but please know I was sorry to hear of your father's passing. It was quite the bit of trouble, so I heard. It was fortunate your good lady arrived when she did. Sir, Fritha is not my, well..."
Anoman trailed off, suddenly wondering whether she wasn't now, though Harn was hardly listening anyway.
The few squires who were there painted quite the picture, and the dormitories here have been buzzing with the tale these last few nights now, how you marched through that merchant's house to take justice for your slain family, so insensible in your rage and grief that none could halt you, and just when it seems all is to be lost, your young lady arrives and calms you with but a word and a kiss. Sorry.
Yes, sighed Harn, sounding rather wistful.
A man driven by a murderous thirst for vengeance only to be stayed by love's hand, and they accuse you Helmites of being cold,
He laughed.
Is that what people are saying?
Exclaimed a Nomen, sincerely hoping Fritha would be inclined to see the funny side.
Well, yes,
agreed Harn with a slight frown,
though this is surely not the first time you have heard it said. But pay them no mind. A man's passions are not defined by the god he kneels to. No, I mean,
a Nomen cut himself off with a sigh.
No matter, sir.
Harn nodded once, seeming to consider something as he regarded the younger knight.
You know, we are having something of a celebration here tonight. Nothing particularly official or formal, but those who are too far from their homes to make a return, or whose only home is here in the order, are gathering in the refectory. You and your company are most welcome to attend if you wish it. The more the merrier, as they say.
A Nomen smiled and bowed sincerely.
My thanks, Sir Harn, I will tell them.
Jahara tilted her face up to the sky, the bitter air sharp against her suddenly exposed throat. They had returned an hour or so ago, the journey out of the city an enjoyable break, and it had been nice to walk the nearby forests, not tracking bandits or hiding from their enemies, but merely for the pleasure of being there beneath the trees. They had split up briefly at around high sun, Jahara moving off to find a secluded place and make her prayers for Khalid, the woman shedding a few tears too, though not as many as she would have thought, and she had felt refreshed as she had rejoined the two men and their small group had finally headed back to the city. They were back at the coronet now, though not inside, Jahara returning to her room only long enough to deposit her bag before moving outside with Minsk to sit upon the high walkway that ran alongside the flat roofs next door, the woman not yet ready to feel the confines of the inn. The people of the slums were busy preparing for the night's coming festivities, local children hanging the traditional streamers of colored paper and ribbon outside their front doors to ward off the evil spirits, while their parents prepared the heavy spiced wine that would be keeping the cold at bay later in the evening. Jahara looked down as the door beneath them opened, Valigar stalking out and glancing up at their greetings.
So, here you both are,
the man continued as he moved to join them, taking a seat on the steps next to Jahara.
Bernard said he saw you leave. As have you are heading over to your estate. The promenade,
he corrected.
I have a few items still to purchase before we leave tomorrow. Where are the others? Herr Dallas and Ari mentioned something about going over to the circus this afternoon, and I imagine Fritha and Anomen are still finalizing matters at his estate.
Valigar snorted, the faintest smile twitching his lips.
Fritha and Anomen, I have been hearing those two names paired up often lately. Yes,
rumbled Minsk,
and Boo is not happy about it either. Why?
Cried Jahara, trying not to laugh.
It is clear to anyone that he loves her. That he might, but he has much growing to do yet. He lashes out with words like fists and hurts her.
Minsk folded his arms looking rather sulky as he added,
and he is not courting her as he should. There have been no contests, no trials to earn her favor. I think perhaps putting up with Fritha this last 10 days has been trial enough,
said Jahara wryly. Valigar sent her a contemplative look.
You sound pleased. I am. She truly likes him, loathed though she is to admit it. Her path will not be an easy one, perhaps she is better off keeping such admissions to herself.
Jahara shrugged mildly.
Perhaps. But a no-man knows the risks as well as she. I was stubborn once, claimed my life had no room for such simple joys, and it did nothing for me. I was my happiest when I was with Khalid, and though I grieve his loss now, I do not regret our union. As the Rashami say, a life without tears is a life half-lived,
Minsk agreed wisely. Jahara nodded.
And you, Korthala?
The ranger sighed.
There are many things I regret, but meeting Suna is not one of them.
A contemplative silence fell over the three, though it did not last for long.
What strange birds to find perched side by side,
called a familiar voice, Jahara glancing down to see Herdalis and Eri strolling along the street beneath them.
Ptarmigan, hawk, and northern owl, I wonder what song they will give us. A dirge would be most appropriate considering the day,
muttered Valigar dryly.
Truly?
Herdalis questioned with a glance to the girl at his side.
Eri led me to understand this was a day of celebration.
Valigar said nothing, though perhaps being the last in the line of a family of cursed ancestors there was very little about the day he could celebrate. Jahara, though, took the more traditional view.
And Eri is right, we celebrate our ancestors and the ones who came before us, a night best spent with families if one is to hand. You will be returning to the circus later, Eri.
The elf nodded, smiling as she linked arms with the man at her side.
Yes, there will be a party too, but it won't even begin until much later. We were helping them to decorate the stage. The circus are putting on a show tonight, just a few of the funnier legends about Faerun's many gods. They are even performing one of Berver and Cheek Tika Fastpaws, and Quail has the honor of playing my lord, Berver.
She laughed delightedly.
But where are Fritha and Anomen? I would have though they would be back here by now. They are still off about the city somewhere, though presumably together,
Jahara offered, her tone eliciting amusement from most of them, though Eri merely gave a frustrated sigh.
Just as they have been every day. I was so sure after what Fritha said in Serk's house they would finally come together, but if anything they have just gone right back to their beginnings. Tut tut, Eri,
scolded the bard,
you should not gossip about such things when you can get them straight from the bird's beak.
He added with a laugh, his sharp eyes catching sight of their young leader at the end of the street.
Ho, my raven!
Fritha waved as she saw them, clearly heading for their group, though her progress along the street was slowed by the fact she was dancing rather than walking, and attracting more than a few strange looks from the people she passed, finally reaching them to slide up to Herdalis and let him twirl her under his arm with a flourish.
Hello there,
she trilled brightly, all pink cheeks and sparkling eyes.
What are we all talking about? Why, love, my raven,
confessed Herdalis to a background of snickering. Fritha smiled artlessly. Oh, well,
'tis the season for it, I suppose. The Day of the Dead, all that romance of death and his minions up and dancing about.
She sighed wistfully.
I wonder what Kaij is doing now. Kaij? Yes,
Fritha nodded solemnly.
This storytelling and feasting is all well and good, but many people forget another tradition of this day, the Nidalfurhten.
Jahara groaned.
Oh, by Sylvanus, trust you to revel in such foolishness. The Nidalfurhten,
repeated Eri, looking as though she was not sure she had heard her correctly.
Yes, children,
explained Jahara, putting an insulting emphasis on the word,
make efforts to scare as many people as they can on this day.
Fritha nodded enthusiastically.
Yes, and on what better a day than the Day of the Dead? A good scare quickens the heart, warms the blood and lets you know you're alive. Imoen and I nobly dedicated ourselves to keeping the tradition for the residents of Candlekeep, and each other. Imoen was much better at sneaking about than me, but the true art to scaring lies in patience. I remember once I spent all night curled up in her linen chest so I could jump out on her when she went to get fresh clothes that first nightly morning. Oh, it was brilliant!
Fritha cried, her voice wavering as she fought to speak through her growing amusement.
We laughed about it afterwards, but at the time I scared her so badly she actually cried. Gods, that was so funny! Her stood there trying to scold me through her tears and me insensible to both as I laughed and laughed.
And it seemed she was about to enjoy a repeat of the thing, Fritha hunched over and shaking as she was finally lost to laughter. Jahara just shook her head, unable to help a smile even as she raised a hand and called out a greeting to the last of their company, a Nomen appearing at the end of the street.
"Hello Nomen,"
said Ari as he finally reached them, those about her echoing the elf.
"Good afternoon."
Nomen glanced briefly to the girl next to him who was still sobbing into her hands. Jahara sighed.
"Do not ask, Nomen. So was everything at your estate finalized?" "Yes, thank you, my lady. My house is now closed up and my servants settled elsewhere. I returned to the order afterwards and Sir Harn informed me there is to be a gathering tonight. We are welcome to attend." Well, Ari,"
teased Herr Dallas,
"your company is in much demand this evening."
Nomen turned to the elf.
"You have a previous engagement, my lady?" "Yes, at the circus, but not until much later on. I can't speak for anyone else, but I would still like to come to the order's gathering."
Herr Dallas grinned.
"Well, where Ari goes, I will follow." "Good,"
nodded Nomen, looking up to those sat on the walkway above.
"And the rest of you?"
A glance between them, before Jahara answered for them all with a nod and a smile.
"I think you can count on our attendance."
Nomen smiled as well, turning to enter the inn.
"Well, that is settled then." "Wait,"
cried Ari, a touch embarrassed as all eyes turned to her though she swallowed her awkwardness to continue,
You haven't asked Fritha."
The collective gaze shifted instantly, an anticipation of knowing smiles, but the girl in question just laughed.
"Of course not, he already knows I will come."
And Nomen held the door open for her as Fritha entered the inn. End of chapter.